Kubernetes or Swarm? It's one of the most popular questions I get after someone learns enough about orchestration to then want to make a decision about which one to use. And I would recommend that you first watch the videos on Swarm, especially the very first video of that's Swarm mode, built-in orchestration, because again, that'll give you the background on why orchestration is necessary to solve certain problems. And then also watch the videos previously in this section about Kubernetes so that you understand the background of both tools before we continue. And as a baseline here, these are both tools that solve similar problems. They're both container orchestrators that run on top of a container runtime. In this video series, you have learned about the Docker container runtime. There are other ones now, Containerd and Cryo. And really, Docker is the number one. It's used in almost every case. And both are backed by vendors and teams of people working on the products. Now, in general, if I had to make a tweet to compare the two, it would simply be that Swarm is easy to build out, easy to add nodes to, easy to get started, and easy to manage. So easy is definitely the one-liner thing that I would say for Swarm. But it doesn't solve all use cases where Kubernetes has much more functionality, flexibility, and customization. It can solve more problems in more ways, and also generally has wider adoption and support. So for you, in order to help you decide which one you want to use, we're going to go through some bullets of advantages of each. And I think it's important really for all of us, if you're going to be in the DevOps community and use these tools to solve business problems, that you should know both. You should be able to install both and then deploy apps on both, and know some of the basic functionality around deploying apps, creating ingress options for traffic coming in, and then updating those apps. And I think that alone will just get you enough of familiarity with the tools so that you know which one to use to solve which problems. So there are many advantages to each. Let's break this down real quick. On the Swarm side, as you've been learning throughout this course, it comes with Docker, so it's a single vendor supported solution, which means that the container runtime and the orchestrator are built by the same company, and that reaps a lot of rewards, including less complexity, smaller resource usage just for running the thing. Running Swarm has very little resource utilization on top of Docker. And it's designed with the developer workflow in mind, so it's very good for ops and developers to use. And like I said, it's easy to deploy and manage. An orchestrator of this type, it can easily grow to many hundreds, if not thousands of nodes, and you won't necessarily need a large team to manage it. You might say that it follows the 80-20 rule, where it has 20% of the features of Kubernetes, and that solves 80% of the use cases for running containers in orchestration. Now, that's not a scientific comparison. I don't really know the exact feature number. I don't know how you'd even really do that. But that seems to be the feel of it when you run both, that you realize that Swarm solves a majority of use cases for running web apps, long-running solutions on servers, whether it's in the cloud or data center, or even on small devices. And it seems to work well out of the box. It has what you need. It has the networking. It has the ingress. It has the encryption, all that stuff. It has the database. So out of the box, it really solves a lot of problems. But it doesn't solve all the use cases for all the scenarios to run an app on a machine. And that's where Kubernetes can fill the gap. Another big advantage of this is that it runs wherever Docker runs. And Docker Engine being 6 years old now, and the start of this whole container revolution, the engine runs in more places than any other tooling. It runs not just on Linux, it runs on Windows, it runs on mainframe, it runs on ARM devices, which means embedded, IoT, Raspberry Pis. It runs on old ARM, new ARM, 32-bit, 64-bit. Like I said, it's just all over the place. It runs natively on Windows Server for years now, since Server 2016. So it definitely is the longest supported orchestrator for a diverse multi-architecture environment, if that's your needs. Out of the box, it is secure, and you've heard me talk about that in this course, that when you create a swarm and you add nodes, it ensures mutual TLS authentication, it encrypts the control plane, and it encrypts the database to protect your secrets in case you want to store those. And that's great because I find a lot of teams, when they're rushed on deadlines or maybe they're a little overwhelmed with the complexity, tend to forget or skip some of the security requirements that other tools like Kubernetes require. And lastly here, I believe that it's easier to troubleshoot because there's less moving parts with it. There's less things to manage. And since it's built into Docker by default, if you know how to troubleshoot Docker, then you probably know how to troubleshoot Swarm. It uses the same daemon logs. It uses the same Docker logs command for the apps. And it uses the same Docker events command for looking at events on the nodes and the Swarm itself. Now that sounds like a lot of advantages for Swarm, but I don't want you to think that that's always going to be the right thing for you. In general, Swarm is the tool that I recommend when people start out and they're starting small. Maybe they're a single person or just 1 or 2, 3 people in their team, and they need to see if a small, simple orchestrator is going to work for them. I always recommend Swarm first. Unless you know absolutely you have to use Kubernetes, I do recommend Swarm. Once you think you've hit some limits in Swarm and you think that you can't quite get what you need out of it, that's when it's time to look at Kubernetes. Let's talk about some of those advantages now. First up, that clouds and vendors really love to support Kubernetes. Since it has become so popular and especially sort of a zeitgeist type popularity in the news and the media, it is something that every vendor now is looking to check off on their list of we support Kubernetes. So I would say it absolutely has the widest cloud and vendor support. Every cloud vendor does provide a offering of Kubernetes. So if you don't want to run it yourself, you can just let them start all the systems up, and then you're essentially just running your apps on there using Kubernetes deployment files. And even infrastructure vendors now have their own Kubernetes distribution, including VMware, Red Hat, even companies like Netflix, who's traditionally just a storage vendor, has their own approved version or distribution of Kubernetes. And so the obvious thing here seems to be that it has the widest adoption and support, and that's definitely true. But beyond that, it also has the widest set of supported use cases. Since it has so many more things to toggle and fiddle with and so many different features and third-party options, it definitely covers more of the edge cases than Swarm does. And in fact, you'll start seeing this with vendors you probably already work with today, where they will do Kubernetes first support, which is my way of saying that vendors will look to see how they can support Kubernetes with their product before they bother to go look at Docker's Swarm product, especially because since the industry is sort of in this attitude of everything needs to support Kubernetes, you're going to find that vendors you already have may already have a distribution or a solution for running their tools on Kubernetes. For example, with Jenkins from the company CloudBees, if you've bought their enterprise solution, they give you Kubernetes tooling and samples on how to run it. Doesn't mean you can't run Jenkins on Swarm. It runs great there. It just means that you're going to get better support from the vendor for that. And the last advantage I'll mention here is sort of a weird advantage. And I'm going to throw up this term of no one ever got fired for buying IBM. Now, this saying was popular decades ago when IBM was the largest vendor for computing and outsourcing your hardware and your mainframes and your PCs. And there was this whole time where they were really killing it in the marketplace. And essentially, if you couldn't make a decision on which vendor you wanted to go with, if you just went the safe way, you would be going with IBM, and you would never really get fired for that because it was the trusted vendor of the time. I would say that in general, for the Kubernetes platform as a whole, that has become the case now, and I would argue it even has gotten to the point of being a checkoff item for CIOs and CTOs. That can be a little bit good and bad because that can mean that you will be told to run Kubernetes even though you don't have technical requirements yet. You're just told by your management that we need to run Kubernetes. And that for them might be just something they want to run regardless of what the technical requirements or benefits are, or comparing it to different platforms. That is obviously part of this political world where IT decisions aren't always made on technical merit or requirements alone. It can often be by the ease of use of buying it. In other words, if you already have a vendor that has one, you might just use their product instead of another one because it's easier. Or your team experience in the background might have better experience from their past jobs or projects, and so you're just going to deploy that one because someone already knows it. Or maybe you're going to buy it because, unfortunately, your management read a magazine or read the internet, and the internet told them they need to pick a certain product like Kubernetes, and so that's the one they're telling you to use. In fact, when I do live workshops and I ask people why they chose the orchestrator they're running, the most common answer I get from them, unfortunately, is still, my boss told me to do this. So people don't always get a say in what they run, which is why I'm trying to give you a good balance of the tooling and features of both so that you'll be the most educated person in your team and be able to help them with the true technical requirements and help you make the best decision.